Hey folks, BlackCross here, and yeah, we are at the end of the year, basically. Ain't that funny? 2016 had a lot to offer, and while it had a lot to offer, it had a lot of ups and downs. And I wouldn't talk about all of the ups and downs, because most of it is either political or stuff that doesn't really interest either of us. But the point is that this year 2016 has proven to be very good in many areas. And while some are better than others, I feel like that I should talk about them. However though, because this show doesn't cover every new game that has come out, and believe me, I can't play every new game that has come out, as instead I'm going to be looking at the games that I personally have played. So in other words, any game that I played through 2016, I'm going to be talking about. Now, of course, this is going to be something that some people may not get, and honestly, it's kind of hard to talk about all the games that's happened this year. So I'm basically going to be talking about particular ones in general. Now, why am I doing something like this? It is because of the fact that last year, Now, you're probably asking yourself, why am I doing something like this? Well, it's because last year I did a highlight reel of all the games that I played up to that point. Unfortunately, though, this year I don't have a good memory of all the reactions that I've had with all of the other games. So as instead, I figured let's talk about the games in general that I have played instead. And while I don't remember my reactions to any of the other games that I played, I do, however, remember what the games have done to me in terms of my personal opinion towards them. Yes, if nothing else, we always remember the games that they do to us. Some of them being great, some of them being awful. And that's why I'm doing my 2016 best, worst, and controversial. With this one, I have 5 different selections. Number 1 being the best bosses. Number 2 being the overall surprise that they have given me. Number 3, game that I personally enjoy, and you'll find out what I mean whenever I say that. Number 4 being the best game of the year, and number 5 being the worst game of this year. And keep this in mind, these are all games that I've already beaten / played in the series. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about the first one, being that the best bosses. For this one, I'm picking Sultan Sanctuary because I really wasn't expecting this to be better than whenever I started playing Dark Souls all those years ago, which was actually like a couple years in all honesty. And basically what had happened was that Sultan Sanctuary came out, and the number one thing I was hearing all over the place is that it was somewhat like a 2D side-scrolling Dark Souls game. And they were partially right, with the exception of the fact that it felt more like a Castlevania in a way. And keep this in mind, I don't play a lot of Castlevania. In fact, I've only played the one Castlevania, but I've never beaten it technically. To a point though, Sultan Sanctuary was actually quite surprising. In fact, all of the bosses that I fought in that game, and trust me when I say this, I make certain that I fought every boss in the game. It was actually really great. I enjoyed every boss fight that I've had, and the only boss that I had trouble with was Witch of the Lake. But of course, thankfully, I'm not the only one who's had trouble with her, so have other people in the process of it all. I think what it was that caused it was because of the fact that she had such a high magic range, and that what was overkilling me, considering in fact how much was actually hitting me in the process of it all. If you're looking for a game that has high replay value, much less entertaining boss fights, Sultan Sanctuary would be that one game that I would introduce to many people. And while I have played Dark Souls 3, I didn't feel like the bosses entertained me as much as Sultan Sanctuary has. And believe me when I say this, even though I beat them relatively quickly, keep this in mind, I built more or less of a strength build, and that's why the majority of them went out quicker than a candle going out with a simple breath of air. Being best of surprise, there were 2 games that have actually made me the surprise the most, both of them being retro-style games. They are Hyper Life Drifter and 3D Dot Game Heroes. These 2 particular gets the tie and quite frankly for good reasons, I was not expecting them to be that enjoyable in terms of gameplay. Another interesting fact is the simple fact that they had both the same stylized of gaming, being that the over-the-head, retro-style action game. Somewhat like that of Legend of Zelda Link to the Past, I suppose, with 3D Game Heroes being more like that, and Hyper Light Drifter being somewhat a little bit of a different, but somewhat the same. Basically, you explore the area, trying to discover each end of the world itself, in order to get to the boss that guards the main point that you need in order to activate, much less need in order to get to the main end of the game. Both of them was equally really good and was fairly equally surprising, but if I had to pick which one was slightly better, I would probably say Hyper Light Drifter, because that one left such an impact to me, because there was very little story at all. None whatsoever. It was somewhat like Dark Souls, where you were left with what you saw in terms of what the actual story was. And when I looked into the lore of Hyper Light Drifter, I was surprised as to what it was actually supposed to be. I had no idea. Whereas 3D Game Heroes, you actually had a story you were following, and therefore it made sense as to what was going on. You're basically the hero that happened to be a descendant of the previous one, and you're basically going through, defeating the monsters, getting the crystals, and using those crystals to defeat the Dark Lord in order to save the universe, or world in this case. Whereas Hyper Light Drifter, you're basically going through each end of the world map itself in order to turn on a main key point in order to activate the center to where you can get to the final boss. And while that one didn't have as many bosses as 3D Game Heroes, Hyper Light Drifter did a little bit better, and it left me quite entertained. 3D Game Heroes did that as well, and it's left me very entertained. But of course, I found out there are a lot more side quests that I didn't even realize actually existed. I know I didn't really complete the game fully, but I do know for a fact that with as many side quests that it had, it definitely had a high chance that I could be replaying it in order to try to get everything that's in the game. Of course, I would also need a strategy guide, so... but Hyper Light Drifter, not completing it by getting all the switches and everything like that are not required, because for starters, they more or less activate like costumes and different stuff like that. So in other words, they're not necessarily. The number 3, basically what I meant whenever I said it, was that the game that I played, I felt like should have been recognized a little bit better. And in my personal opinion, and in my personal honesty, I think this game did very well. The only problem is that it has some side problems. I'll get to those in just a sec, but the game that I'm talking about should be mentioned is Destiny. I didn't really play through the main story campaign, but I did a co-op series with some of my close friends. But for some reason, Destiny has had like an up and down syndrome about it. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that for some odd reason, Destiny just lost interest to a lot of people. For a lot of people played it when it first came out, and then throughout the time that it's been out, it sort of had like this up and down of where people would just play it. But the problem is that it wasn't one of those games that people constantly play. Not like that of, for example, Final Fantasy XIV, or for that matter, World of Warcraft. Destiny just doesn't have that charm that people need in order to keep playing it. For someone like me who first played it, it was worth it. And considering the fact that I bought it after The Rise of Iron came out, it certainly was well worth the investment as well as well worth the fun. I put in a lot of hours just by playing through the main game, and then going through the side missions and everything like that, and then I discovered that there were actual armor pieces that you could actually attain, along with actual chips and stuff like that I was wanting to get. And while I did get the armor pieces from the Rise of Iron book, I was not, however, able to get all of the stuff that I wanted. Because for some reason, to get it is like a high requirement in certain areas. For example, there were 2 particular things that I couldn't get, much less buy. It was more of wait until it eventually gets available. One of them being the Gilgamesh color shade, and then the other one being a particular ship that I wanted to get from Holiday herself. Both of them just did not want to show up for some reason. And then of course, to get the next thing I wanted to do, which was to get the different armor pieces from the Rise of Iron, I needed to get the Rise of Iron ornament. And to do that, you have to go through the very hard difficulty of the Shrikes. And let's put it this way. They're very hard, so if you're wanting to do this, you need to do it with a good group of people that you know, much less that you know can get through it relatively easy. And the only reason why I didn't get it then was because all my friends basically kind of gave up on it. Which is weird, because I'm hearing that there might be coming back to it after this new update, but it's not a definite yet, so I don't know if it will happen or not. But I do want to try to go back and play through Destiny again whenever the time does come. And here's the thing. Destiny, to me, I actually enjoyed it a lot better than most others because the first-person perspective was actually done really well and it controlled perfectly in my personal opinion. Most FPSs, in my opinion, are absolute shit. And the reason why I say this is because for some reason, with the camera angle and everything like that of the first-person view, it's just so jarring that it makes me nauseous. It makes me want to vomit even. And that's why games like, for example, DayZ Mankind Divided didn't really do well for me. Mostly because the first-person camera wasn't that good. And then several other FPSs, the reason why I haven't picked them up was because of that same problem. Whereas Destiny, once I was playing that game, the camera was absolutely perfect. It didn't leave me jarring at all. It was a game that I could actually play for hours on end. And that was a good thing in my opinion. Bungie did an amazing job with this one. I just hope they keep that same functionality in Destiny 2. And to a lot of people who have played it, I hope they would concentrate more of staying with Bungie 2 and not so much work on a third installment while the game has been out. Because from what people have said, the same problem applies to any other MMORPG, where the developer needs to be more invested with the game that has been released recently, rather than the game that's being released in the future. And I have to agree on that one. If you're going to keep your audiences, you need to keep them entertained throughout the one game that they have. And by all means, do not charge them for a full game. What do I mean by that? Well, both Rise of Iron as well as his previous one, The Taken King, were $30 each. So in other words, had I have gotten the game when it first technically came out, I probably would have ended up paying $120 or even $150 for some odd reason. And no, I don't plan on using microtransactions. Why can't you make the silver where you can get it a little at a time? Why? I'll never know. That part just does not make sense. Destiny, I felt like, was a pretty good opportunity, but it had a few problems that could have been fixed. For example, for someone like me, it could have used a lot better attainable items and a less of a requirement and not a heavy random drop rate. And now we've got to the best of 2016, and some of you already know what that game is. It is none other than Final Fantasy 15. It was actually really good, and despite some of the small complaints that I might have about the game itself, Final Fantasy 15 was actually really fun and really entertaining. I kept playing the game, I really have. I literally did all of the side quests, I've done almost all of the hunts. I pretty much have platinumed the game. I just recently platinumed it myself. And then of course, if nothing else, I'm still waiting for the future DLC that they'll be releasing. And the future DLC that they've got going on is looking really exciting. We've still got the Choco Mog Festival that's going to be going on in late January. We've got the 3 individual DLC, being that of Gladio, Ignis, and Prompto DLC. And then of course we also got another major DLC that we'll be getting in the future. Not going to mention it because someone already spoiled it to me. but I am definitely looking forward to that. And then of course we've got small DLCs coming out throughout the year, probably no less. Final Fantasy 15, I'm hoping will get better as these updates gets delivered to us. And on another notion, I cannot wait to see what else they're going to be putting up in the future. The worst game, and believe me, there's actually been a couple of them. The worst game of 2016. Now keep this in mind. The worst of 2016 is by far the worst. It is something that I personally felt like they could have done better. And something that I felt like should have been concentrated more on, and rather than them doing experiments and stuff like that. What game is that? Well, surprisingly, it's not Mighty Number 9. Yeah, there's something much worse than Mighty Number 9. It is none other than Star Fox Zero. Star Fox Zero just... it was so bad. Here's the first problem with the game. The first problem was that it was basically repeating the same story that was retold to us about 3 or 4 times. From where it was first released on the SNES, then the N64, then the 3DS, and now for the 4th time, it is basically repeating the same story. With a different plot line, but pretty much the same fucking story. Why couldn't Nintendo come up with a new storyline? I'll never know. I was actually hoping that this might be like a prequel of some kind, or something along that line. As instead, we didn't get that. We got pretty much a repeat of A New Beginning. What? And if that wasn't the worst case, you've also got the cream of the crop itself. I cannot believe how salty I was at the end of that series. I really was surprised of how pissed off I was. And keep this in mind, it takes a lot to piss me off to a point to where I'm that ragey. And I just, to quote my friends, I was pretty salty that day. The controls on that game was horrendous. I thought I was getting better at it, only to find out I was actually getting worse at it. The controls in that game was just too much for me to handle. Why couldn't Nintendo made it to where it could have made it optional to use a regular controller and not use the stupid C, whatever you call that thing, the little motion detection thing? I don't quite get it. It's bad enough that it actually does that. Another bad thing is the fact that it has a reset analog. And when you're in a bad position and you actually use it, it becomes the worst thing ever. I'm all over the place and I'm why can't I control this thing? And if that's not the worst case, you have to use both that screen and your main screen. You're concentrating on 2 different ones, and it's nearly impossible. So it's why even make a game where you have to concentrate on 2 different screens at the same time? And for this particular game in general, the controlling was just terribly shitty. Just the worst I've ever seen in my entire life. And you don't do that to a game. You don't do that to a game where the controlling in it is just absolutely terrible. You need to do it to where people can even play it, much less be able to use it. Because at the end of the day, it becomes another terrible game that gets recognized. And while Nintendo has made some great games in the past, I felt like Star Fox Zero was the worst of them all. And yes, I do believe it is the worst of them all, because while I've not played every Nintendo title, I do know for it being a mainstream title, it definitely wasn't good. I just hope that Nintendo learns from this mistake, and maybe they'll do better. I hope. So that was 2016 of my previous mentions. Some of the best, some of them being the worst, some of them could have done better, but honestly, I actually was surprised with what 2016 had to offer of the games that I have played. I'm hoping 2017 will be better, what with the fact that we are continuing on with our Kingdom Hearts series, and then of course Kingdom Hearts 3 and 2.8 will hopefully be released this year, what with 2.8 being released early this year, and I'm hoping Kingdom Hearts 3 will be released later on that year. who really knows? But hopefully you'll join with me as we enjoy the experience overall of everything that these games have to offer. And I hope to see you in 2017. Take care, guys, and have a happy new year.